Hey everyone, welcome back to another dive into the gritty, uncomfortable truths that history books tend to gloss over. Tonight we're stepping into the smoke-filled, grease-stained world of medieval kitchens, where the people responsible for feeding entire castles lived lives that would make modern restaurant workers seem pampered by comparison. Before we get started, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy these deep dives into history's forgotten corners, and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching and what medieval job you think would have been the absolute worst. Now settle in, maybe grab a snack, and let's explore why being a medieval cook was less about culinary artistry and more about surviving another day in what was essentially a hot, dangerous, thankless nightmare. When you think of medieval feasts, your mind probably conjures images of golden roasted birds, platters overflowing with exotic delicacies, and satisfied nobles raising goblets in celebration. What you probably don't picture is the small army of exhausted, burned, and perpetually stressed individuals who made those grand meals possible. Medieval cooks weren't celebrated chefs with their own cooking shows. They were labourers trapped in a world where a single mistake could mean unemployment, public humiliation, or worse. The medieval kitchen was a battlefield disguised as a workplace. Unlike modern kitchens with their precise temperature controls, safety regulations, and ergonomic designs, medieval cooking spaces were chaotic environments where fire, smoke, sharp objects, and scalding liquids created a constant dance with disaster. Most castle kitchens were built separately from the main living quarters, not out of convenience, but because they were genuinely dangerous places that regularly caught fire and filled with toxic smoke. Picture this. You're standing in a cavernous stone room where the ceiling disappears into smoky darkness above your head. The floor beneath your feet is slippery with grease, blood, and spilled liquids that have soaked into the stone over decades of use. Multiple fires burn simultaneously across the space, each one demanding constant attention to prevent them from either dying out or raging out of control. The heat is oppressive, even in winter, turning the kitchen into a sweltering hellscape where sweat mingles with smoke and steam. The tools of the trade were primitive by modern standards. Heavy iron pots that required 2 people to lift when full, knives that dulled quickly and needed constant sharpening on rough whetstones, wooden spoons that absorbed flavours, odours, and bacteria from countless previous meals, ladles that conducted heat so efficiently that grabbing one without thinking could leave permanent scars on your palms. Everything was designed for function over safety, and function barely worked most of the time. Water was a luxury that had to be carried by hand from wells or streams, often located considerable distances from the kitchen. Every drop used for cooking, cleaning, or drinking had to be hauled in heavy buckets by servants who were already exhausted from their other duties. Running out of water during meal preparation wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. Imagine trying to put out a grease fire or clean scorched pots when your nearest water source required a 10-minute walk each way. The hierarchy in medieval kitchens was as rigid as anywhere else in feudal society, but with the added pressure of immediate, life-altering consequences for failure. At the top sat the head cook, a position that sounds prestigious until you realise it meant taking personal responsibility for feeding dozens or sometimes hundreds of people with unpredictable ingredients, unreliable equipment, and constantly changing demands from above. Below the head cook, a complex web of assistants, scullery maids, potboys, and kitchen servants formed a chain where everyone's survival depended on everyone else doing their job perfectly. Being promoted to head cook wasn't a reward. It was a trap. You became the single point of failure for the entire household's nutrition and satisfaction. If the Lord's guests were disappointed with their meal, it wasn't the scullery maid who faced consequences. If supplies ran short unexpectedly, it wasn't the potboy who had to explain to an angry noble why dinner was delayed. The head cook bore the weight of every burned sauce, every undercooked roast, every shortage of spices or wine. Medieval cooks worked without clocks, thermometers, or standardized measurements. Cooking times were estimated by experience and prayer. Temperatures were judged by how close you could hold your hand to the fire before the pain became unbearable. Recipes, when they existed at all, were vague suggestions rather than precise instructions. A handful of this, a pinch of that, cook until it looks right, season to taste. In a world where getting it wrong could mean facing an enraged nobleman with the power to end your career or your life, this uncertainty was a constant source of stress. The seasonal nature of medieval life meant that cooks had to be masters of adaptation. In spring, they worked with whatever had survived the winter storage, often ingredients that were starting to spoil or lose their potency. Summer brought abundance, but also the challenge of preserving fresh foods in a world without refrigeration. Autumn was a frantic race to prepare and store enough food to last through the lean winter months. And winter itself was a test of creativity, stretching dwindling supplies across seemingly endless cold, dark months while maintaining the appearance of abundance for their employers. Storage was a nightmare that would make modern food safety inspectors weep. Grain was kept in wooden barrels that provided easy access for rats, mice, and insects. Meat was preserved through salting, smoking, or drying, processes that required constant vigilance to prevent spoilage. Dairy products were stored in cool cellars that were nevertheless warm enough for bacteria to thrive. Vegetables and fruits were kept in root cellars that could flood during heavy rains or freeze solid during harsh winters. The medieval cook was expected to be part chef, part alchemist, part fortune teller. They had to predict how many guests might arrive unexpectedly for dinner. They had to estimate how much food to prepare when the exact number of diners was constantly changing. They had to know which of their stored ingredients were still safe to eat and which had crossed the line into dangerous territory. They had to understand the complex social dynamics of their household, knowing which dishes would please which nobles and which combinations of foods might cause offence or suggest inappropriate meanings. Spices were worth their weight in gold, literally, in some cases, and managing them was like being trusted with the crown jewels. A cook who used too much pepper or cinnamon could bankrupt their employer. A cook who used too little could be accused of stealing or incompetence. Many spices came from distant lands through trade networks that could be disrupted by war, weather, or political upheaval, meaning that ingredients considered essential one month might be completely unavailable the next. The physical demands of medieval cooking were brutal. Cooks spent their entire workday on their feet, often for 12 or more hours at a stretch. They lifted heavy pots, stirred thick stews with wooden implements that absorbed heat, hauled water, chopped vegetables with dull knives that required significant force to cut through tough ingredients, and worked in temperatures that would be considered unsafe by modern standards. Their hands were constantly exposed to burns, cuts, and chemical irritation from the primitive cleaning compounds of the era. Medieval kitchens operated without proper ventilation, meaning that smoke from cooking fires filled the air continuously. Cooks developed chronic respiratory problems from breathing this toxic atmosphere day after day, year after year. Their eyes watered constantly from the smoke, making precise work even more difficult. The combination of heat, smoke, and steam created an environment where accidents were inevitable and potentially fatal. The pressure to maintain appearances was immense. Medieval feasts weren't just meals. They were displays of wealth, power, and status. Every dish had to look impressive, even if it was made from inferior ingredients. Every course had to arrive at the perfect moment in the elaborate choreography of medieval dining. The cook was responsible not just for nutrition, but for theatre, for creating the illusion of abundance and luxury even when resources were scarce. Personal hygiene among kitchen staff was virtually non-existent by modern standards, not by choice but by necessity. Water was too precious to waste on frequent bathing. Soap was expensive and reserved for the wealthy. Kitchen workers went weeks without changing their clothes, which absorbed grease, smoke, and food particles until they became stiff, smelly suits of armour against the elements. Their hair was constantly exposed to smoke and steam, their fingernails permanently stained with food and soot. The social status of cooks was paradoxical. They were essential to the functioning of any large household, yet they were considered servants, barely above the level of stable hands or field workers. They handled food that nobles would eat, yet they were forbidden from eating the same quality of ingredients they prepared. They possessed specialized knowledge and skills that took years to develop, yet they could be dismissed without notice if their work displeased their employers. Medieval cooks had no job security whatsoever. They served at the pleasure of their lords, and that pleasure could change as quickly as the weather. A single bad meal could end a career that had taken decades to build. Political changes, economic downturns, or simple personal conflicts could leave experienced cooks unemployed and unemployable. Their specialized skills worthless without access to the kitchens and resources needed to practice them. The medieval kitchen was a place where science, superstition, and desperation mixed in equal measure. Cooks relied on folklore and tradition to guide their decisions, often with mixed results. They believed that certain combinations of foods could cure illnesses or cause them. They thought that cooking during certain phases of the moon would affect the outcome of their dishes. They carried charms and said prayers over their pots, hoping that supernatural forces would compensate for their lack of reliable techniques and equipment. The fear of food poisoning was a constant shadow hanging over every medieval cook's shoulder. Without understanding bacteria, germs, or proper food safety, they navigated a minefield of potential disasters purely through experience and luck. Spoiled meat could kill nobles, sour milk could cause days of violent illness, and contaminated water could spark epidemics that would devastate entire households. Yet cooks had no reliable way to test their ingredients beyond smell, taste, and appearance, methods that were often inadequate for detecting the invisible threats lurking in their food stores. When food poisoning did strike, and it struck regularly, the cook bore full responsibility. There were no health inspectors to blame, no supply chain investigations to absolve guilt. If the lord fell ill after dinner, everyone knew exactly who was at fault. The punishment for accidentally poisoning your employer ranged from immediate dismissal to public flogging, and in extreme cases, execution. This wasn't paranoia or excessive cruelty. In a world where medical knowledge was primitive and antibiotics didn't exist, food poisoning could easily become a death sentence. Medieval cooks developed an intimate relationship with rats, mice, and insects that modern chefs would find horrifying. These weren't occasional intruders to be dealt with by pest control professionals. They were permanent residents of every kitchen, dining on stored grain, contaminating surfaces, and leaving their droppings throughout the food preparation areas. Cats were kept as working animals specifically to control rodent populations, but they were fighting a losing battle against creatures that reproduced faster than they could be eliminated. The grain stores that formed the backbone of medieval cuisine were particularly vulnerable to infestation. Weevils, beetles, and other insects burrowed into wheat, barley, and oats, laying eggs that would hatch weeks or months later. Cooks learned to sift flour multiple times, picking out bugs and larvae that had become part of the ingredients. This wasn't considered disgusting or unusual. It was simply part of the job, another skill that separated experienced cooks from novices who might faint at the sight of their dinner crawling away. Bread, the foundation of every medieval meal, presented unique challenges that would break modern bakers. Yeast was unpredictable, sometimes refusing to work for mysterious reasons. Ovens were heated by building fires inside them, then raking out the coals and relying on retained heat to bake the loaves. Temperature control was impossible, leading to bread that was burned on the outside and raw in the middle, or perfectly baked if the gods of cooking smiled favourably that day. The process of making bread consumed enormous amounts of time and labour. Grain had to be winnowed to remove chaff, ground by hand using heavy stone querns, sifted to remove the coarsest particles, mixed with water that might or might not be clean, kneaded until the dough developed proper texture, shaped into loaves, and then carefully monitored throughout the baking process. A single batch of bread for a large household could require an entire day's work from multiple people, and there was no guarantee it would turn out edible. Medieval ovens were shared community resources in many areas, adding another layer of complexity to bread making. Cooks had to coordinate with their neighbours, waiting their turn and hoping the oven temperature would still be adequate when their slot arrived. Arguments over oven access could turn violent, and sabotage wasn't unheard of. A rival cook might deliberately leave their bread in too long, using up precious heat that others were depending on. The preservation of meat was both an art and a gamble with death. Salt was expensive, but essential for curing, and using too little meant watching valuable protein rot away. Using too much made the meat inedibly salty, wasting both the original ingredient and the precious salt used to preserve it. Smoking meat required constant attention to maintain the right temperature and smoke density, a process that could take days during which the cook couldn't leave their post for more than brief moments. Fresh meat was a luxury that came with its own set of dangers. Animals were typically slaughtered on the premises, meaning cooks had to be skilled butchers as well as chefs. They worked with sharp knives on slippery surfaces, breaking down entire carcasses while racing against time before spoilage set in. Blood, bones, and organ meat had to be processed immediately. Nothing could be wasted, and every part of the animal had to find its way into some dish or preservation method. The medieval cook's relationship with fire was intimate and terrifying. Open flames provided the only source of cooking heat, but they were hungry, unpredictable beasts that could consume a lifetime's work in minutes. Grease fires erupted without warning when fat dripped onto hot coals. Clothing caught fire from standing too close to roaring hearths. Hair was singed off regularly, and serious burns were considered occupational hazards rather than preventable accidents. Managing multiple cooking fires simultaneously required the focus of an air traffic controller and the reflexes of a firefighter. Each fire burned at a different temperature, depending on the type of wood, the age of the coals, and the amount of airflow. Cooks learned to read the colour of flames, the sound of crackling wood, and the behaviour of smoke to judge cooking temperatures. A moment's inattention could result in ruined food, dangerous flare-ups, or the complete loss of heat needed to finish a meal. The seasonal availability of ingredients turned every medieval cook into a master of improvisation. Spring brought tender young vegetables, but also the reality that winter stores were nearly exhausted and often spoiling. Summer's abundance had to be processed immediately, or it would rot, leading to frantic days of preserving, drying, and storing. Autumn demanded careful calculation of exactly how much food would be needed to survive until the next harvest, with no room for error in either direction. Winter cooking was an exercise in creative desperation. Root vegetables stored in cellars developed soft spots that had to be cut away, often leaving little usable material. Preserved meats became increasingly salty and tough as the months passed. Dried fruits turned hard as stones and had to be soaked for hours before they became edible. Every meal required stretching, dwindling ingredients to feed the same number of mouths, often by adding more water to make thin soups and stews that provided little nutrition but created the illusion of fullness. The medieval cook's day began before dawn and ended long after sunset, a grueling schedule that left no time for rest, family, or personal interests. They rose in darkness to rekindle fires that had been banked overnight, hoping that embers still glowed beneath the ashes. The first task was always assessing what had survived the night, checking that stored food hadn't spoiled, that water hadn't frozen solid, that rats hadn't devastated the grain supplies. Meal planning was a constant juggling act, involving incomplete information and changing demands. The number of people to feed could change without notice as guests arrived or family members departed. Dietary restrictions based on religious observances meant certain ingredients were forbidden on specific days, requiring entirely different menus with little advance warning. Seasonal prohibitions during Lent eliminated meat, eggs and dairy products for weeks at a time, forcing cooks to create satisfying meals from a dramatically reduced palette of available ingredients. The physical workspace of a medieval kitchen would violate every modern safety regulation imaginable. Floors were uneven stone or packed earth that became treacherously slippery when wet. Lighting came from candles or oil lamps that provided barely enough illumination to work safely, while adding fire hazards and toxic fumes to an already dangerous environment. Ceilings were low and often blackened with soot from years of cooking fires, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere that trapped heat and smoke. Storage areas were poorly ventilated spaces where food competed with vermin for survival. Wooden shelves absorbed odours, moisture, and bacteria from countless meals, becoming breeding grounds for contamination. Clay pots cracked from temperature changes, spilling their contents and creating messes that attracted more pests. Metal containers were expensive luxuries that most kitchens couldn't afford, leaving cooks to rely on organic materials that deteriorated rapidly under constant use. The social dynamics within medieval kitchens were as complex and dangerous as the cooking itself. Kitchen staff formed tight bonds born of shared hardship, but they also competed fiercely for the limited opportunities for advancement. Sabotage between rival cooks wasn't uncommon, from stealing ingredients to deliberately ruining dishes that competitors were preparing. Romantic relationships bloomed in the intense atmosphere of shared work, but they also created jealousies and conflicts that could explode into violence. Information was power in the medieval kitchen, and experienced cooks guarded their secrets jealously. Recipes were rarely written down, passed instead through oral tradition that could be withheld, modified, or deliberately corrupted to prevent others from mastering valuable techniques. A cook who knew how to properly spice wine or create delicate pastries held knowledge that could secure their position or be traded for favours, advancement, or protection. The constant pressure to perform without adequate resources created a culture of chronic stress that modern workers would find unbearable. Every meal was a test that could determine the cook's future, yet they worked with tools and ingredients that made failure almost inevitable. Sleep was fitful and brief, interrupted by worries about tomorrow's menu, the condition of stored food, or the temperament of demanding employers who expected perfection from imperfect circumstances. Medieval cooks developed a fatalistic worldview that accepted injury, illness, and early death as natural consequences of their profession. They watched colleagues suffer from chronic respiratory problems caused by smoke inhalation, saw friends lose fingers to sharp knives and hot surfaces, and witnessed the steady deterioration of their own bodies under the relentless demands of their work. Yet they continued because alternatives were even worse and the skills they possessed were too specialised to transfer easily to other occupations. The relationship between medieval cooks and their employers was built on mutual dependence and mutual mistrust. Lords needed skilled cooks to maintain their social standing and feed their households, but they also viewed kitchen staff as potential thieves, spies, and sources of contamination. Cooks possessed intimate knowledge of their employers' habits, preferences, and vulnerabilities, information that could be valuable to enemies or rivals. This created an atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion that made every workday feel like walking through a minefield of political intrigue. Kitchen accidents weren't minor inconveniences that could be treated with first aid and workers' compensation. They were life-altering catastrophes that ended careers and often ended lives. A severe burn from scalding oil or boiling water could become infected in a world without antibiotics, leading to blood poisoning and death within days. Cuts from dull knives that required significant pressure to use often severed tendons, leaving cooks with permanently disabled hands that made their specialised skills worthless. The most feared injury was losing an eye to flying grease or steam, a surprisingly common occurrence in kitchens where multiple fires burned simultaneously and protective equipment didn't exist. A cook who couldn't see properly became a danger to everyone around them, unable to judge distances when handling sharp objects or gauge temperatures when working near open flames. Partial blindness meant immediate dismissal, leaving the injured worker to face a future of begging or starvation. Medieval medicine's approach to treating kitchen injuries ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. Burns were often treated with applications of butter, honey, or various herbal concoctions that frequently made infections worse. Cuts were sewn shut with whatever thread was available, usually the same material used for mending clothes, with no understanding of sterilization or proper wound care. Pain comfort while potentially causing additional health problems. The psychological toll of working relief consisted of alcohol or herbal remedies that provided minimal in medieval kitchens was as devastating as the physical damage. Cooks developed a hypervigilant state of mind, constantly scanning for potential disasters while trying to maintain focus on complex cooking tasks. Sleep was plagued by nightmares about fires spreading out of control, food spoiling unexpectedly, or accidentally poisoning important guests. Many kitchen workers developed what we would now recognize as anxiety disorders, manifesting in trembling hands, racing hearts, and an inability to relax even during rare moments of rest. The isolation of kitchen work created additional mental health challenges. While other servants might interact with various members of the household throughout their day, cooks were largely confined to their hot, smoky domain, seeing the same faces and dealing with the same stresses hour after hour. The intense heat and poor air quality affected cognitive function, making it difficult to think clearly or make good decisions during the most critical moments of meal preparation. Relationships between kitchen staff were complicated by the constant pressure and competition for limited resources. Friendships formed quickly in the shared misery of brutal working conditions, but they could dissolve just as rapidly when survival was at stake. A cook who hoarded a precious spice or failed to share crucial information about spoiled ingredients could find themselves ostracized by colleagues who depended on cooperation for their own survival. The apprenticeship system in medieval kitchens was less about education and more about exploitation. Young people, often children, were bound to experienced cooks for years of unpaid labour in exchange for learning trade secrets that might never be fully revealed. Apprentices performed the most dangerous and unpleasant tasks, from cleaning grease traps to handling rotting food scraps, while receiving minimal instruction and frequent abuse from masters who viewed them as disposable labour rather than future colleagues. Kitchen apprentices lived in conditions that would shock modern observers. They slept on straw pallets in storage rooms, often sharing space with rats and insects that considered the kitchen their permanent home. Their diet consisted of scraps and leftovers deemed unfit for the tables they served. Nutritionally inadequate meals that left them malnourished and susceptible to disease. Education was limited to kitchen skills, leaving them illiterate and innumerate, trapped in a profession that offered few opportunities for advancement or escape. The gender dynamics in medieval kitchens reflected the broader inequalities of feudal society, but with additional complications created by the intimate nature of food preparation. Female cooks faced constant sexual harassment and assault from male colleagues and employers who viewed kitchen staff as available for their pleasure. Women who became pregnant had no legal protections and were often dismissed immediately, left to face single motherhood in a society that offered no support for unwed mothers. Male cooks weren't immune to sexual exploitation, particularly young apprentices who were vulnerable to abuse from older, more powerful kitchen staff. The isolated nature of kitchen work and the rigid hierarchy that discouraged complaints created an environment where sexual violence was common and rarely reported. Victims had no recourse through legal systems that didn't recognize their rights or social structures that viewed their suffering as irrelevant. The seasonal rhythm of medieval life created predictable cycles of abundance and scarcity that drove kitchen staff to the edge of physical and mental exhaustion. Harvest time meant weeks of frantic activity, processing enormous quantities of fruits, vegetables, and grains that had to be preserved before they spoiled. Cooks worked 18-hour days during these crucial periods, knowing that failure to properly preserve the harvest could mean starvation during the winter months. Slaughter season brought its own horrors, as kitchen staff became temporary butchers dealing with blood, gore, and the screams of dying animals. The smell of fresh blood mixed with wood smoke and cooking fat created an atmosphere that modern workers would find unbearable, but medieval cooks endured because the alternative was watching valuable protein rot away unused. Every part of slaughtered animals had to be processed immediately, from organs that spoiled within hours to bones that needed to be cracked for marrow before they hardened beyond use. The preservation process itself was a race against time and bacteria that cooks couldn't see or understand. Meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried using techniques passed down through generations, with no scientific understanding of why these methods worked or how to improve them. A batch of preserved meat that spoiled could represent weeks of labour and valuable resources lost, potentially leaving the household without adequate protein stores for the winter. Winter brought its own unique challenges as stored food supplies dwindled and fresh ingredients became impossible to obtain. Cooks became masters of stretching meagre resources, creating the illusion of abundance from roots, preserved meat, and grain that was often mouldy or infested with insects. Every meal required careful calculation of remaining supplies, balancing the need to feed people adequately against the necessity of making food stores last until spring. The psychological pressure of winter cooking was immense, as cooks knew that running out of food meant not just professional failure, but potential death for everyone in the household. They lay awake at night, calculating how many meals could be created from remaining supplies, adjusting portions and ingredients to stretch resources as far as possible while maintaining the appearance of adequate nutrition for their employers. Religious dietary restrictions added another layer of complexity to an already impossible job. Medieval Christianity imposed numerous fasting periods throughout the year, during which certain foods were forbidden and others became mandatory. Lent eliminated meat, eggs, and dairy products for 40 days, forcing cooks to create satisfying meals from fish, vegetables, and grains, while maintaining the elaborate presentation expected at noble tables. The fish required for religious fasting periods presented unique challenges in an era without refrigeration. Fresh fish spoiled within hours of being caught, requiring immediate preparation or preservation. Salt fish was expensive and required lengthy soaking to remove excess salt before it could be cooked. Dried fish was tough and required creative preparation to make it palatable, often involving pounding it to break down tough fibres and soaking it in various liquids to restore moisture and flavour. Religious feast days created the opposite problem, requiring elaborate meals that demonstrated wealth and piety while using ingredients that might be in short supply. Easter demanded eggs and dairy products after weeks of abstinence, but chickens and cows didn't automatically increase their production to accommodate religious calendars. Christmas required special foods and elaborate preparations that stretched kitchen resources and staff to their absolute limits. The social expectations surrounding religious meals were particularly burdensome for kitchen staff. These weren't just ordinary dinners, but symbolic statements about the household's devotion and status. Every dish had to be perfect. Every course had to arrive at precisely the right moment, and the overall presentation had to demonstrate both wealth and spiritual commitment. The pressure was enormous, and the consequences of failure extended beyond professional embarrassment to potential accusations of undermining the household's religious standing. Medieval cooks had no reliable methods for measuring ingredients, temperatures, or cooking times. Recipes, when they existed at all, used vague descriptions like a handful of flour or cook until done, leaving enormous room for interpretation and error. Experienced cooks developed an intuitive understanding of their ingredients and techniques, but this knowledge was difficult to transfer to apprentices and impossible to standardize across different kitchens. The lack of standardized measurements meant that successful dishes were difficult to replicate consistently. A recipe that worked perfectly one day might fail completely the next, depending on variations in ingredient quality, fire temperature, weather conditions, or simply the cook's physical and mental state. This unpredictability created constant anxiety, as cooks never knew whether their time-tested techniques would produce acceptable results. Temperature control was perhaps the most critical and least reliable aspect of medieval cooking. Ovens were heated by building fires inside them, then removing the coals and relying on residual heat to cook food. Judging the correct temperature required experience and intuition, often supplemented by crude tests like holding a hand near the oven opening to gauge heat levels, or throwing flour inside to see how quickly it browned. The primitive nature of temperature control meant that baking was particularly unpredictable. Bread might emerge perfectly golden and fully cooked, or it might be burned on the outside and raw in the middle, depending on factors beyond the cook's control. Multiple loaves baked simultaneously in the same oven often cooked differently, creating waste and frustration that cooks had to absorb without complaint. Timing multiple dishes to finish simultaneously required skills that would challenge modern chefs working with precise equipment and reliable heat sources. Medieval cooks had to coordinate roasts that took hours to cook, vegetables that required different cooking times, sauces that could curdle if left unattended, and bread that had to be served warm from the oven. All of this coordination happened without clocks, thermometers, or timers, relying entirely on experience and luck. The consequences of poor timing extended beyond culinary disappointment to social and political disasters. Meals that arrived late could be interpreted as disrespect toward important guests. Dishes that were overcooked or undercooked reflected poorly on the entire household's competence and status. In extreme cases, poorly timed meals could contribute to diplomatic tensions or business negotiations that affected the household's economic and political position. Medieval kitchens operated without adequate lighting, making precise work dangerous and difficult. Cooking fires provided flickering, uneven illumination that created moving shadows and made it hard to judge the colour and texture of food. Candles and oil lamps added some light, but also introduced additional fire hazards in spaces already filled with open flames and combustible materials. The poor lighting conditions contributed to frequent accidents as cooks struggled to see what they were doing while working with sharp knives, hot surfaces, and boiling liquids. Cuts and burns were more common in the evening hours, when natural light faded and artificial illumination proved inadequate for safe kitchen work. Many cooks developed permanent eye strain from squinting in poor light conditions, adding to their long list of occupational health problems. Working in dim conditions also made food safety more challenging, as cooks couldn't easily inspect ingredients for signs of spoilage or contamination. Mouldy bread, spoiled meat, and rotten vegetables were harder to identify in poor light, increasing the risk of accidentally serving dangerous food to demanding employers who would hold cooks personally responsible for any resulting illness. The medieval cook's relationship with time was fundamentally different from modern concepts of scheduling and punctuality. Without mechanical clocks, they relied on natural indicators like the position of the sun, the behaviour of animals, and the rhythms of the household to judge when meals should be prepared and served. This imprecise system created constant anxiety about whether food would be ready at the appropriate time. Seasonal variations in daylight hours further complicated timing issues. Summer days stretched endlessly, making it difficult to judge when evening meals should be served. Winter days ended abruptly, often catching cooks unprepared as darkness fell before their work was complete. The lack of reliable artificial lighting meant that winter cooking often continued by the flickering light of cooking fires, creating dangerous working conditions that increased the risk of accidents and errors. The unpredictable nature of medieval life meant that meal schedules could change without warning. Unexpected guests might arrive, requiring additional food preparation on short notice. Religious observances might alter normal eating patterns. Political emergencies could disrupt household routines entirely. Cooks had to remain flexible and ready to adapt their plans, even when adaptation seemed impossible, given their limited resources and primitive equipment. Medieval cooks existed in a state of perpetual exhaustion that would be considered inhumane by modern standards. Their workdays began before dawn with the rekindling of fires and ended well after sunset with the cleaning and preparation for the next day's meals. Sleep was brief and often interrupted by concerns about food safety, fire hazards, or tomorrow's menu challenges. The physical demands of medieval cooking created cumulative injuries that worsened over time. Backs bent permanently from lifting heavy pots and working over low fires. Hands became gnarled and scarred from constant exposure to heat, sharp objects, and caustic cleaning compounds. Feet swelled and developed chronic pain from standing on hard stone floors for 12 or more hours each day. Respiratory problems were virtually universal among medieval kitchen staff due to constant exposure to smoke, steam, and airborne particles from grinding grain and chopping vegetables. Chronic coughing, wheezing, and shortness of breath were accepted as normal parts of the job rather than preventable occupational hazards. Many cooks developed serious lung conditions that shortened their lives and made their final years even more miserable. The combination of physical exhaustion, chronic pain, and respiratory problems created a workforce that aged rapidly and died young. Kitchen staff who survived to old age were rare, and those who did were often disabled by decades of abuse their bodies had endured. There were no pensions, no retirement plans, no social safety nets for cooks who could no longer perform their demanding jobs. The economic realities facing medieval cooks were as harsh as their working conditions. Unlike modern chefs who can build reputations and command higher wages based on skill and experience, medieval cooks were trapped in a system where their value was determined entirely by their current employer's whims. They had no professional organisations to protect their interests, no standardised wage scales, and no legal recourse when employers decided to reduce their compensation or eliminate their positions entirely. Payment for kitchen work was often irregular and unpredictable. Many cooks received their wages in kind rather than coin, given food, clothing, and shelter, instead of money that could be saved or spent according to their own priorities. This system left them completely dependent on their employers for survival, unable to accumulate resources that might provide security during illness, injury, or unemployment. When monetary wages were paid, they were typically calculated by the season or year, with no guarantee that future payments would arrive as promised. The barter-based economy of medieval life meant that cooks often had to negotiate for basic necessities, using whatever goods or services they could offer in exchange. A cook who needed new shoes might have to trade a portion of their food ration to a cobbler. Someone requiring medical attention might have to promise future kitchen services to an herbalist or physician. This constant negotiation for survival created additional stress and uncertainty in lives already filled with more hardship than most people could bear. Kitchen staff had virtually no opportunity to save money or build wealth, even if they managed to earn coin wages. The cost of basic necessities consumed nearly all of their income, leaving nothing for emergencies or future planning. A sick cook who couldn't work faced immediate destitution, with no savings to fall back on and no social systems to provide support. This economic vulnerability made kitchen workers desperate to maintain their positions at any cost, accepting abuse and exploitation rather than risking unemployment. The seasonal nature of medieval employment created additional financial insecurity for kitchen staff. Large households might reduce their cooking staff during winter months, when food stores were limited and fewer guests visited. Cooks who were dismissed for the season faced months of unemployment with no income, forced to find temporary work or rely on charity to survive until they might be rehired in the spring. This cycle of employment and unemployment made long-term financial planning impossible. Marriage and family life were luxuries that many medieval cooks could barely afford. The demands of their work left little time for courting or maintaining relationships. The physical exhaustion and health problems caused by kitchen work made them less attractive as potential spouses. Even cooks who managed to marry faced the challenge of supporting a family on wages that were barely adequate for a single person. Female cooks who became pregnant faced immediate dismissal in most households, as employers were unwilling to accommodate the physical limitations and time requirements of pregnancy and childbirth. With no legal protections for pregnant workers and no social support for single mothers, pregnancy often meant destitution for female kitchen staff. Many women resorted to dangerous methods of preventing or ending pregnancies rather than face the economic catastrophe of bearing children they couldn't support. Children of kitchen workers inherited their parents' low social status and limited opportunities. They were often pressed into kitchen service at young ages, beginning the cycle of exploitation and abuse that had trapped their parents. Education was virtually non-existent for children from kitchen families, leaving them illiterate and innumerate with no skills beyond basic cooking techniques that locked them into the same desperate existence their parents had endured. The apprenticeship system that supposedly provided training for young cooks was actually a form of legalized exploitation that benefited established workers at the expense of newcomers. Apprentices worked for years without wages, receiving only basic food and shelter in exchange for their labour. Masters often extended apprenticeships longer than necessary to continue benefiting from free labour, and many apprentices never received the complete training they had been promised. Even successful completion of an apprenticeship didn't guarantee employment or adequate wages. The medieval economy had limited demand for skilled cooks, and competition for positions was fierce. Former apprentices often found themselves competing against each other for jobs that paid barely enough to survive, driving wages down and working conditions to even more desperate levels. The guild system that protected other medieval crafts largely excluded kitchen workers, leaving them without the professional organisations that might have improved their working conditions and economic prospects. Cooks had no collective bargaining power, no standardised training programmes, and no mechanisms for sharing knowledge or supporting colleagues who faced hardship. They were isolated individuals competing against each other in a system designed to exploit their desperation. Geographic mobility was extremely limited for medieval kitchen workers. Travel was expensive and dangerous, and cooks who left their positions to seek better opportunities elsewhere often found themselves stranded without resources in unfamiliar places. The specialised knowledge of local ingredients, cooking techniques, and household preferences that made a cook valuable in one location might be worthless in another region with different culinary traditions. The lack of literacy among most kitchen workers prevented them from accessing written information that might have improved their skills or expanded their opportunities. They couldn't read recipes, contracts, or correspondence that might have helped them advance their careers. This illiteracy also made them vulnerable to exploitation by employers who could misrepresent agreements or obligations without fear of challenge. Record keeping in medieval kitchens was minimal and often non-existent, making it difficult for cooks to prove their experience or accomplishments when seeking new positions. Unlike other crafts that produced tangible goods that could serve as evidence of skill, cooking produced only temporary results that disappeared as soon as meals were consumed. A cook's reputation depended entirely on the testimony of former employers who might not be willing or able to provide references. The medical understanding of medieval times meant that occupational injuries and illnesses were often misunderstood or misattributed to personal failings rather than working conditions. Cooks who developed chronic coughs from smoke inhalation might be blamed for having weak constitutions rather than being recognised as victims of workplace hazards. This lack of understanding prevented any systematic efforts to improve kitchen safety or protect worker health. Mental health problems among kitchen workers were completely unrecognised and untreated. The constant stress, physical pain and social isolation that characterised kitchen work undoubtedly caused depression, anxiety and other psychological conditions that medieval medicine couldn't identify or address. Cooks who showed signs of mental distress were often dismissed as lazy, unreliable, or possessed by evil spirits rather than being seen as people who needed help. The religious framework of medieval society offered little comfort to suffering kitchen workers. While Christianity preached about the dignity of all people and the rewards awaiting the faithful in the afterlife, the practical reality was that kitchen staff were treated as barely human by the society around them. Religious authorities rarely intervened to improve working conditions or challenge the exploitation of kitchen workers, instead focusing on the spiritual salvation of wealthy patrons who could afford to make substantial donations. Seasonal religious observances created additional burdens for kitchen staff who were expected to prepare elaborate feast meals while observing the same fasting requirements as everyone else in the household. They spent their days handling rich foods they weren't allowed to eat, creating dishes they couldn't afford to prepare for their own families, and working extra hours to accommodate religious celebrations that provided them with no additional compensation or recognition. The superstitions and folk beliefs of medieval culture added another layer of stress to kitchen work. Cooks were often blamed for household misfortunes that were attributed to their supposedly improper handling of food or failure to observe various ritual requirements. A noble who fell ill might blame the cook for using unlucky ingredients or preparing food during an inauspicious time, leading to punishment or dismissal based on completely irrational beliefs. Kitchen workers lived in constant fear of being accused of theft, poisoning, or other crimes that could result in severe punishment, including torture and execution. The valuable ingredients and finished dishes in their care made them natural suspects when food went missing or people became ill. They had no legal protections and no way to defend themselves against accusations from employers who held absolute power over their lives and deaths. The isolation of kitchen work meant that abusive treatment often went unwitnessed and unreported. Cooks who were beaten, sexually assaulted, or otherwise mistreated by employers or colleagues had no recourse through legal systems that didn't recognise their rights as human beings. The closed nature of kitchen environments allowed predators to operate with impunity, knowing that their victims had no power to seek justice or protection. Fire was both the essential tool and the greatest threat in every medieval kitchen. Open flames were necessary for cooking, but impossible to control completely, creating an environment where catastrophic accidents were always just moments away. Kitchen fires could spread rapidly through wooden buildings, destroying not just individual livelihoods, but entire communities. Cooks lived with the knowledge that a single moment of carelessness could result in deaths, homelessness, and destruction that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The primitive firefighting methods available in medieval times meant that kitchen fires often burned out of control before they could be stopped. Water was scarce and had to be carried by hand from distant sources. Fire buckets were small and ineffective against large blazes. Sand and dirt could smother small fires, but were useless against flames that had already spread beyond the initial ignition point. When kitchen fires started, the usual outcome was complete destruction of the building and everything in it. Cooks developed an acute awareness of fire behaviour and prevention techniques born from a necessity rather than formal training. They learned to recognize the warning signs of dangerous conditions, the sound of grease beginning to overheat, the smell of wood starting to smoulder, the visual cues that indicated flames were spreading beyond their intended boundaries. This knowledge was literally a matter of life and death, not just for themselves but for everyone in the buildings they worked in. The responsibility for fire safety fell entirely on kitchen staff, who had to maintain constant vigilance while also focusing on the complex tasks of meal preparation. They checked and rechecked fire conditions throughout their workdays carefully, banking at night, clearing combustible materials from around cooking areas, and maintaining buckets of water or sand for emergency use. The mental burden of this constant watchfulness added to their already overwhelming stress levels. Kitchen accidents involving fire were rarely treated as unavoidable mishaps, but rather as evidence of negligence or incompetence on the part of kitchen staff. Cooks who allowed fires to spread faced severe punishment, regardless of the circumstances that led to the incident. This blame placed on workers rather than on the inherently dangerous nature of their working conditions created additional pressure to take risks and work in unsafe ways rather than acknowledge the limitations of their primitive equipment and techniques. The seasonal storage of fuel for cooking fires created another set of challenges for medieval kitchen staff. Wood had to be cut, dried, and stored during appropriate weather conditions to ensure adequate supplies throughout the year. Wet or green wood produced more smoke and less heat, making cooking more difficult and dangerous. Poor quality fuel could cause fires to behave unpredictably, creating additional hazards in an already dangerous environment. Different types of wood burned at different temperatures and produced different flavors in cooked food, requiring cooks to understand the characteristics of various fuel sources and how to use them effectively. Oak burned hot and long, but was expensive, and sometimes reserved for heating rather than cooking. Pine and other soft woods burned quickly and produced resinous smoke that could ruin the taste of delicate dishes. Fruit woods were prized for smoking meats, but were often in short supply. The procurement and preparation of cooking fuel was typically the responsibility of the lowest-ranking kitchen workers, who had to split logs, carry wood, and maintain fuel supplies regardless of weather conditions or their other duties. This physical labour was demanding and dangerous, involving sharp axes, heavy loads, and the constant risk of injury from flying wood chips or unstable log piles. Charcoal production was another specialised skill that some kitchen workers had to master, involving the careful burning of wood in oxygen-limited conditions, so that burned H produce a few hotter and cleaner than raw wood. The charcoal making process was time-consuming and required constant attention to prevent the wood from burning completely to ash rather than forming the desired carbon-rich fuel. The cost of fuel represented a significant portion of kitchen operating expenses, creating pressure to use wood and charcoal as efficiently as possible while still maintaining the high temperatures needed for proper cooking. Cooks had to balance fuel conservation against food quality, often making compromises that affected the taste and safety of the meals they prepared. Storage of prepared fuel presented additional challenges in medieval kitchens where space was limited and conditions were often damp. Wood that became wet was difficult to ignite and produced excessive smoke when burned. Charcoal that absorbed moisture lost its effectiveness and could be ruined entirely if not properly protected from rain and humidity. The primitive ventilation systems in medieval kitchens meant that smoke from cooking fires often filled working spaces, creating health hazards and making it difficult to see clearly enough to work safely. Cooks developed chronic respiratory problems from breathing smoke-filled air for hours each day, problems that were made worse by the poor nutrition and stressful working conditions that characterized their lives. Kitchen design. In medieval times, prioritized functionality and fire safety over worker comfort or health. Cooking areas were typically located away from main living spaces to reduce fire risks, but this isolation meant that kitchen workers were cut off from the social life of the households they served. They worked in hot, smoky, dangerous spaces, while the people they fed enjoyed comfortable, well-ventilated rooms nearby. The stone construction common in medieval kitchens provided some fire resistance, but created other problems, including poor insulation, that made kitchens extremely hot in summer and bitterly cold in winter. Stone floors were hard on feet and joints, contributing to the chronic pain that plagued most kitchen workers. The thermal mass of stone construction meant that kitchen temperatures were slow to change, remaining uncomfortably hot long after cooking fires had been banked for the night. Drainage in medieval kitchens was primitive or non-existent, leading to standing water that created unsanitary conditions and breeding grounds for insects and disease. Wastewater from cooking and cleaning had to be carried out by hand and disposed of away from food preparation areas, adding to the physical demands placed on kitchen staff who were already working beyond their physical limits. The multi-level construction, common in larger medieval kitchens, created additional safety hazards, as workers carried heavy pots and dangerous materials up and down stairs that were often steep, narrow, and poorly lit. Falls were common and frequently resulted in serious injuries that ended careers and sometimes lives. The vertical organisation of kitchen spaces also made communication between workers more difficult, increasing the risk of accidents and coordination problems. Professional development opportunities for medieval cooks were virtually non-existent beyond the basic apprenticeship system that often failed to provide adequate training. There were no culinary schools, no professional conferences, no published materials that could help cooks improve their skills or learn new techniques. Knowledge was passed down through oral tradition and direct observation, methods that were inefficient and often incomplete. The secrecy surrounding cooking techniques meant that even experienced cooks had limited knowledge beyond what they had learned in their specific working situations. Recipes and methods were guarded carefully by those who possessed them, creating a system where innovation was discouraged and improvement was slow or non-existent. This isolation of knowledge prevented the systematic development of better cooking methods that might have improved both food quality and working conditions. Travel opportunities that might have exposed cooks to different techniques and ingredients were extremely rare and usually limited to the most senior kitchen staff. The vast majority of cooks spent their entire careers working in similar conditions with similar ingredients, never experiencing the broader culinary world that might have expanded their skills and perspectives. The lack of written records meant that successful innovations in cooking techniques were often lost when their creators died or moved to different positions. Valuable knowledge about food safety, preservation methods, and cooking techniques disappeared regularly, forcing each generation of cooks to rediscover solutions to problems that had been solved before. Communication between kitchens in different households was minimal, preventing the sharing of information that could have benefited all cooks. Even kitchens in the same geographic area operated in isolation from each other, missing opportunities for mutual support and knowledge sharing that could have improved working conditions and job security for everyone involved. The hierarchical nature of medieval society meant that suggestions for improvement from kitchen workers were rarely welcomed or even tolerated by employers who viewed their servants as incapable of understanding the complexities of household management. Cooks who attempted to propose changes to improve efficiency or safety often faced punishment for presuming to know better than their social superiors. Innovation in kitchen equipment and techniques was slow and often met with suspicion from conservative employers who preferred traditional methods regardless of their effectiveness or safety. New ideas were seen as potential threats to established order rather than opportunities for improvement, creating an environment where progress was actively discouraged. The economic incentives for improving kitchen conditions were minimal, since kitchen workers had no power to demand better treatment, and employers could easily replace dissatisfied workers with others who were equally desperate for employment. This lack of economic pressure for improvement meant that dangerous and inefficient practices continued unchanged for generations. The medieval cook's relationship with ingredients was fundamentally different from modern culinary relationships with food. They worked with materials that were often of poor quality, inconsistent availability, and questionable safety, creating challenges that required constant adaptation and creativity. Unlike modern chefs who can rely on standardized ingredients with predictable characteristics, medieval cooks had to evaluate and adjust for variations in everything they used. Grain, the foundation of medieval cuisine, came with its own set of problems that would horrify modern food safety inspectors. Wheat, barley and oats were stored in conditions that encouraged infestation by insects, contamination by rodents, and growth of molds that could be toxic to humans. Cooks learned to sift, sort and salvage what they could from supplies that were often partially spoiled or contaminated. The grinding of grain into flour was a laborious process that required significant time and physical effort, using primitive stone querns or hand mills. The resulting flour was coarse, inconsistent, and often contained particles of stone from the grinding process that could damage teeth and digestive systems. Sifting flour multiple times was necessary to remove the largest impurities, but fine particles of stone and other contaminants remained in even the best medieval flour. Seasonal variations in grain quality meant that cooks had to constantly adjust their techniques and expectations based on when the grain was harvested and how long it had been stored. Fresh grain from recent harvests behaved differently than older grain that had lost moisture and developed off flavours during storage. Grain that had survived winter storage often required special treatment to mask rancid flavours and remove insects that had made their homes in the stored supplies. The lack of understanding about nutrition meant that medieval cooks had no knowledge of vitamins, minerals, or other essential nutrients that modern chefs consider when planning meals. They worked purely from tradition and experience, often creating nutritionally deficient diets that contributed to health problems throughout medieval society. Diseases caused by nutritional deficiencies were common and often attributed to supernatural causes rather than inadequate diets. Vegetables in medieval kitchens were limited to varieties that could be grown locally and preserved through winter months without refrigeration. The selection was narrow compared to modern produce sections, consisting mainly of root vegetables, cabbage, onions, and herbs that could survive harsh growing conditions and long storage periods. Fresh vegetables were available only during growing seasons and had to be processed immediately or allowed to spoil. The preservation of vegetables required techniques that often reduced their nutritional value and palatability. Salting, drying, and pickling were the primary preservation methods available, all of which significantly altered the taste and texture of the original vegetables. Many preserved vegetables became unrecognisably different from their fresh counterparts, requiring creative cooking techniques to make them palatable. Root cellars and other storage methods for vegetables were primitive and unreliable, often resulting in significant losses due to rot, freezing, or pest damage. Cooks had to regularly inspect stored vegetables and remove spoiled specimens to prevent contamination from spreading to the rest of their supplies. The constant battle against spoilage consumed time and energy that could have been used for other tasks. Meat in medieval kitchens came with challenges that extended far beyond simple preparation and cooking. Animals were typically slaughtered on the premises, requiring kitchen staff to have butchering skills in addition to their cooking abilities. The slaughter process was messy, dangerous, and time-sensitive, as meat began to spoil rapidly without refrigeration. The quality of medieval meat varied enormously depending on the age, health, and diet of the animals being slaughtered. Older animals produced tough, stringy meat that required long cooking times and special techniques to make it edible. Sick animals might be slaughtered to prevent total loss, resulting in meat of questionable safety and quality that cooks had to work with regardless of their concerns. Preservation of meat was critical for survival through winter months, when fresh animals weren't available for slaughter. Salt curing, smoking, and drying were the primary preservation methods, all of which required careful attention to prevent spoilage that could waste valuable protein and potentially poison those who consumed it. The preservation process itself was labour-intensive and required constant monitoring to ensure proper results. The seasonal availability of fresh meat created feast or famine cycles in medieval kitchens. Slaughter time brought abundance that had to be processed immediately, often requiring kitchen staff to work around the clock to preserve meat before it spoiled. The rest of the year, cooks had to work with preserved meat that became increasingly tough, salty, and unpalatable as storage time extended. Dairy products presented unique challenges in medieval kitchens where refrigeration was impossible and pasteurization unknown. Milk spoiled rapidly and had to be processed into cheese, butter, or other preserved forms within hours of being obtained from animals. The cheese-making process required specialized knowledge and equipment that not all kitchens possessed, often resulting in waste of valuable dairy products. The storage of dairy products was problematic in medieval conditions, where temperatures fluctuated widely and contamination was difficult to prevent. Butter became rancid, cheese developed dangerous molds, and other dairy products spoiled in ways that could cause serious illness or death. Cooks had to develop skills in evaluating dairy products for safety while working without the scientific knowledge needed to understand the processes of spoilage and contamination. Eggs were another ingredient that required careful handling and quick use to prevent spoilage in conditions where refrigeration was impossible. The seasonal nature of egg production meant that fresh eggs were abundant during certain times of year and completely unavailable during others. Preservation methods for eggs were limited and often unsuccessful, resulting in waste of valuable protein sources. The unpredictable availability of ingredients meant that medieval cooks had to be masters of substitution and improvisation. When expected ingredients were unavailable, spoiled, or of poor quality, cooks had to find alternatives that would produce acceptable results without compromising food safety or palatability. This constant need for adaptation required creativity and flexibility that went far beyond simple recipe following. Spices and seasonings were expensive luxuries that had to be used sparingly and stored carefully to prevent waste. Many spices came from distant lands through trade networks that could be disrupted by war, weather, or political upheaval, making their availability unpredictable and their cost variable. Cooks had to balance the desire to create flavorful dishes against the economic reality of limited spice budgets. The storage of spices presented special challenges as many lost their potency over time or became contaminated with moisture that caused them to spoil or lose flavour. Proper storage containers were expensive and often unavailable, forcing cooks to improvise protection for valuable seasonings that could represent significant portions of kitchen budgets. The adulteration of spices was common in medieval trade, with expensive seasonings often mixed with cheaper substitutes, or contaminated with foreign materials to increase profits for merchants. Cooks had to develop skills in evaluating spice quality and detecting adulteration while working without the testing methods or regulatory protections that modern chefs take for granted. Medieval cooks operated in a world where every ingredient was a potential source of danger, every meal was a test of survival skills, and every day brought new challenges that had to be overcome with primitive tools and inadequate knowledge. The resilience and creativity they displayed in the face of these overwhelming obstacles speaks to the strength of the human spirit, even as it highlights the brutal realities of their daily existence. Their stories remind us that behind every historical feast, every grand banquet, every seemingly abundant medieval table, stood individuals whose lives were consumed by the relentless demands of feeding others while struggling to survive themselves. They were the invisible workforce that made medieval society possible, yet their contributions were rarely acknowledged, and their suffering was largely ignored by the very people who depended on their skills for survival. The medieval cook's experience serves as a stark reminder of how far we've come in terms of working conditions, food safety, and workers' rights, while also highlighting the timeless human capacity to endure hardship and find ways to create something meaningful even in the most difficult circumstances. Their legacy lives on not in grand monuments or written histories, but in the simple fact that they kept civilization fed during one of humanity's most challenging periods. Understanding the complexity of medieval ingredient procurement reveals just how precarious a cook's position truly was. Unlike modern chefs who can simply order what they need from reliable suppliers, medieval cooks depended entirely on whatever their employers could afford, acquire, or produce locally. This meant working with ingredients that arrived sporadically, in varying qualities, and often in conditions that would be considered unacceptable by any modern standard. The procurement process itself was fraught with uncertainty and potential conflict. Cooks rarely had direct control over purchasing decisions, instead receiving whatever ingredients their employers' stewards managed to obtain through trade, local production, or sometimes questionable means. A cook might plan an elaborate meal around expected deliveries of specific items, only to discover that trade routes had been disrupted, crops had failed, or political tensions had made certain ingredients unavailable. Local production of ingredients created its own set of challenges that directly impacted kitchen operations. Garden vegetables were subject to weather, disease, and pest damage that could wipe out entire crops without warning. Livestock could fall ill, die unexpectedly, or be stolen by neighbours or bandits, leaving cooks without the meat, dairy, or eggs they had planned to use. Even herbs grown specifically for kitchen use were vulnerable to environmental factors that could destroy a season's worth of carefully tended plants overnight. The quality control of ingredients was entirely the responsibility of kitchen staff, who had to evaluate everything that arrived in their workspace. Grain shipments might contain significant amounts of dirt, stones, or other foreign matter that had to be painstakingly removed before use. Meat could arrive already partially spoiled, requiring cooks to salvage what they could, while discarding portions that were too far gone to use safely. Medieval cooks developed an encyclopedic knowledge of ingredient evaluation that encompassed visual inspection, smell testing, texture assessment, and even taste testing of potentially dangerous materials. They learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated whether stored grain had become infested with insects, whether preserved meat was developing dangerous bacteria, or whether dairy products were beginning to spoil in ways that could cause serious illness. The economic pressures surrounding ingredient use created additional stress for kitchen workers, who were expected to minimize waste while producing satisfactory results. Every scrap of food had value in medieval households where resources were limited and nothing could be discarded carelessly. Cooks had to find uses for ingredients that were past their prime, incorporating slightly spoiled vegetables into stews where their off flavours might be masked, or using tough, old meat in preparations that would break down its fibrous texture. Seasonality dictated not just ingredient availability, but also the fundamental approach to menu planning throughout the medieval year. Spring brought tender young vegetables and fresh dairy products, but also the challenge of working with winter stores that were reaching the end of their useful life. Summer's abundance required immediate processing and preservation, often overwhelming kitchen staff with the sheer volume of work required to prepare for the lean months ahead. The preservation techniques available to medieval cooks were limited, labour-intensive, and frequently unsuccessful despite their best efforts. Salt curing required precise knowledge of salt-to-meat ratios, proper storage conditions, and careful monitoring throughout the curing process. Smoking demanded constant attention to fire management, temperature control, and timing that could easily go wrong if other kitchen duties interfered with the process. Fermentation was another preservation method that medieval cooks employed with varying degrees of success, creating pickled vegetables, fermented dairy products, and alcoholic beverages that could extend the useful life of perishable ingredients. However, fermentation was an unpredictable process that could produce either beneficial preservation or dangerous spoilage, depending on factors that medieval cooks didn't fully understand. The storage facilities available in medieval kitchens were primitive by modern standards, consisting mainly of root cellars, grain bins, and simple shelving that provided minimal protection against temperature fluctuations, moisture, pests, and contamination. These storage areas required constant maintenance and monitoring, adding to the already overwhelming workload of kitchen staff, who were responsible for preserving valuable food supplies. Inventory management was a critical skill that medieval cooks had to master without the benefit of written records or systematic tracking methods. They had to maintain mental catalogues of what ingredients were available, in what quantities and in what condition, while also projecting future needs and planning for seasonal variations in supply and demand. The unpredictability of medieval life meant that ingredient requirements could change dramatically without warning. Unexpected guests could double the number of people requiring meals, while political or religious events might alter dietary requirements entirely. Cooks had to maintain flexibility in their planning while working with inflexible ingredients that couldn't be easily substituted or modified. Regional variations in ingredient availability created additional challenges for cooks who might be required to work in different locations or adapt to changing local conditions. Techniques and recipes that worked well with locally available ingredients might be completely unsuitable when different materials were the only options available. The medieval cook's relationship with local suppliers was often complicated by social hierarchies, economic pressures, and personal relationships that could affect both the quality and availability of ingredients. Farmers, herders, and other food producers were themselves struggling to survive and might prioritize their own needs over the requirements of distant kitchens. Trade networks that brought exotic ingredients from distant regions were unreliable and subject to disruption by weather, political conflicts, and economic factors beyond anyone's control. Spices, dried fruits, and other imported items might be available one season and completely unobtainable the next, forcing cooks to constantly adapt their techniques and expectations. The knowledge required to work effectively with medieval ingredients extended far beyond simple cooking techniques to include understanding of agriculture, animal husbandry, food chemistry, and preservation methods that modern chefs take for granted. Medieval cooks had to be generalists who could handle every aspect of food production from raw materials to finished dishes. The physical demands of ingredient preparation were enormous, requiring cooks to process everything by hand using primitive tools and techniques that were labour-intensive and time-consuming. Grinding grain, churning butter, plucking fowl, and breaking down large animals were all part of the regular routine that consumed hours of back-breaking labour. The safety hazards associated with ingredient handling were numerous and largely unrecognised by medieval society. Contaminated water, spoiled meat, toxic plants, and dangerous preservation chemicals were all part of the daily reality that cooks had to navigate without the benefit of modern scientific understanding or protective equipment. The nutritional knowledge available to medieval cooks was limited to folk wisdom and traditional practices that were often inadequate for maintaining health, especially during periods of scarcity when dietary variety was severely limited. Deficiency diseases were common and often attributed to supernatural causes rather than inadequate nutrition. The psychological stress of working with unreliable, potentially dangerous ingredients created a constant state of anxiety that affected every aspect of kitchen work. Cooks lived with the knowledge that using the wrong ingredient or failing to properly identify spoiled food could result in illness, death, or accusations of poisoning that could destroy their careers and their lives. Quality control standards were determined entirely by the expectations and preferences of employers who might have unrealistic demands or inconsistent requirements. A dish that pleased one noble might be completely unacceptable to another, forcing cooks to constantly adjust their techniques and ingredients to match the whims of their current employers. The waste management challenges created by ingredient processing were significant in medieval kitchens where nothing could be discarded carelessly. Every bone, scrap of meat, vegetable trimming, and grain hull had to be either incorporated into other dishes, fed to animals, composted, or disposed of in ways that wouldn't create sanitation problems or attract pests. The seasonal rhythms of ingredient availability created predictable periods of abundance and scarcity that required different approaches to menu planning and food preparation. Cooks had to develop expertise in working with preserved foods during winter months, while also mastering the techniques needed to process and preserve fresh ingredients during harvest time. The cultural and religious significance of certain ingredients added another layer of complexity to medieval cooking, as cooks had to understand not just the practical aspects of food preparation, but also the symbolic meanings and social implications of different dishes and ingredients. The economic value of ingredients created pressure to maximize their utility while minimizing waste, often requiring creative approaches that could transform less desirable materials into acceptable dishes through skillful preparation and seasoning. The medieval cook's expertise in ingredient management was developed through years of hands-on experience, trial and error, and knowledge passed down through oral tradition. This learning process was inefficient and often incomplete, leaving gaps in knowledge that could have serious consequences when dealing with unfamiliar ingredients or unusual circumstances. The transportation and delivery of ingredients to medieval kitchens was a complex process that could affect their quality and safety in ways that cooks had to compensate for through their preparation techniques. Long journeys in primitive conditions often meant that ingredients arrived damaged, partially spoiled, or contaminated in ways that required immediate attention. The storage and rotation of ingredients required constant vigilance to prevent spoilage and ensure that older materials were used before they became unsafe. This inventory management was complicated by the lack of reliable dating systems and the difficulty of accurately assessing the condition of stored foods. The seasonal preservation of ingredients was a race against time that required perfect coordination between harvesting, processing, and storage activities. Failure at any stage of this process could result in significant losses that might affect the household's food security throughout the winter months. The medieval cook's relationship with ingredient suppliers was often complicated by social class differences, economic pressures, and the limited options available in local markets. Negotiating for better quality or more reliable delivery was difficult when alternatives were scarce and suppliers held most of the bargaining power. Working with primitive ingredient preparation tools meant that tasks that modern chefs complete quickly and efficiently required hours of manual labour from medieval cooks. The physical toll of this constant manual work contributed to the chronic health problems that plagued kitchen workers throughout their careers. The lack of standardization in ingredient quality meant that medieval cooks had to constantly adjust their techniques and expectations based on the specific characteristics of whatever materials they had available. Recipes that worked with one batch of flour might fail completely with flour from a different source or grinding process. The integration of seasonal ingredients into year-round menu planning required sophisticated knowledge of preservation techniques, storage methods, and creative approaches to maintaining dietary variety despite limited options. Medieval cooks became masters of adaptation, finding ways to create satisfying meals from whatever ingredients were available. The medieval kitchen represented a complex ecosystem where ingredient management, food safety, preservation techniques, and creative adaptation all had to work together seamlessly despite primitive tools, inadequate knowledge, and constant pressure from demanding employers. The cooks who managed to succeed in this environment demonstrated remarkable resilience, creativity, and dedication that deserves recognition even centuries after their struggles ended. The daily reality of managing ingredients in medieval kitchens required skills that went far beyond simple cooking, encompassing agriculture, chemistry, logistics, and risk management in ways that modern chefs rarely have to consider. These forgotten heroes of culinary history worked miracles with inadequate resources, creating the foundation for food traditions that continue to influence our understanding of cooking and hospitality today. Their struggles with ingredient procurement, storage, preparation, and safety remind us of how much we take for granted in our modern food systems, while also highlighting the timeless human drive to create nourishment and satisfaction even under the most challenging circumstances. The medieval cook's relationship with ingredients was a testament to human adaptability and the eternal importance of feeding others, regardless of the personal cost involved in that essential work. The procurement of water alone was a daily nightmare that would break modern restaurant workers within hours. Every drop used in medieval kitchens had to be carried by hand from wells, streams, or cisterns that were often located significant distances from cooking areas. A single day's cooking and cleaning might require hundreds of gallons of water, all transported one heavy bucket at a time by kitchen workers who were already exhausted from their other duties. The quality of available water was questionable at best and deadly at worst. Wells could become contaminated with animal waste, human sewage, or the runoff from decomposing organic matter. Streams and rivers served as dumping grounds for household waste, animal carcasses, and the byproducts of various crafts and industries. Medieval cooks had no way to test water safety beyond basic visual inspection and taste testing, methods that were wholly inadequate for detecting the invisible dangers lurking in their water supplies. Boiling water was the only purification method available, but it required precious fuel and time that kitchen staff could barely spare. The decision of whether to boil water for cooking versus conserving fuel for other essential tasks was a daily gamble with potentially fatal consequences. Many cooks chose to risk using unboiled water rather than delay meal preparation or exhaust their fuel supplies, a calculated risk that sometimes proved catastrophic. Storage of water in medieval kitchens presented additional challenges that modern food service workers never face. Large wooden barrels and clay vessels served as water storage containers, but these primitive systems were prone to contamination, leakage, and the growth of dangerous organisms. Water stored for more than a few days often developed foul tastes, strange odours, or visible growths that made it unsuitable for cooking or drinking. The seasonal availability of clean water created predictable crises that kitchen staff had to navigate without adequate resources or backup systems. Winter freezes could make water sources inaccessible for days or weeks, forcing cooks to melt snow and ice that might be contaminated with animal waste or other hazardous materials. Summer droughts could reduce water supplies to a trickle, creating competition between cooking needs and basic human survival requirements. Wastewater disposal was another constant challenge that required careful planning and significant physical effort. Every drop of water used for cooking, cleaning, or food preparation had to be removed from kitchen areas to prevent the build-up of stagnant pools that attracted insects, rodents, and disease-carrying organisms. The disposal process involved carrying heavy containers of dirty water to locations far enough from food preparation areas to prevent contamination. The primitive drainage systems in medieval kitchens were often inadequate for handling the volume of wastewater generated by daily cooking operations. Stone floors with minimal grading allowed water to pool in low spots, creating permanent wet areas that became breeding grounds for bacteria and other harmful microorganisms. These standing water problems contributed to the unsanitary conditions that made kitchen work even more dangerous and unpleasant. Cleaning and sanitation in medieval kitchens relied on methods that would horrify modern health inspectors. Soap was expensive and often unavailable, forcing kitchen workers to clean pots, utensils, and surfaces with combinations of hot water, sand, ash, and whatever abrasive materials they could find. These primitive cleaning methods were largely ineffective against bacterial contamination and often left residues that could contaminate future food preparations. The reuse of cleaning water was common practice in medieval kitchens where every drop was precious and waste was unacceptable. The same water might be used to wash multiple pots, clean various surfaces, and rinse utensils before finally being disposed of. This practice spread contamination throughout the kitchen, creating cross-contamination problems that medieval cooks couldn't understand or prevent. Personal hygiene among kitchen staff was virtually non-existent by modern standards, not by choice but by necessity imposed by their working conditions. Water for bathing was a luxury that few kitchen workers could afford, both in terms of the physical effort required to heat and transport it and the time needed for personal care that had to be stolen from their overwhelming work schedules. Most kitchen staff went weeks or months without proper washing, their bodies becoming repositories of grease, smoke, and food particles that created additional sanitation hazards. The clothing worn by medieval kitchen workers became progressively more contaminated and dangerous as it absorbed grease, food particles, and various liquids throughout the workday. These garments were rarely washed due to the scarcity of water, soap, and time needed for laundry. Instead, kitchen workers wore the same clothes day after day until they became stiff with accumulated grime and potentially hazardous to both the wearer and the food being prepared. Hair and beard management among kitchen staff was another sanitation nightmare that medieval society was ill-equipped to address. Long hair was common among both men and women, and it inevitably became contaminated with smoke, grease, and food particles during kitchen work. The lack of effective hair coverings meant that this contaminated hair could easily fall into food being prepared, creating both aesthetic and safety problems that diners had to simply accept as normal. The tools and equipment used in medieval kitchens were primitive, dangerous, and often contaminated in ways that would shut down modern food service operations immediately. Wooden spoons, cutting boards, and storage containers absorbed flavours, odours, and bacteria from countless previous uses, becoming permanent sources of cross-contamination that could spoil fresh ingredients and spread foodborne illnesses throughout the household. Sharpening kitchen knives was a constant necessity and a significant safety hazard that required skills most modern chefs never develop. Dull blades were dangerous to use and inefficient for food preparation, but the sharpening process involved whetstones, steel files, and other tools that could cause serious injuries when used by tired, stressed workers in poorly lit conditions. The quality of knife maintenance directly affected both worker safety and food preparation efficiency. The maintenance of cooking pots and pans was a never-ending battle against rust, corrosion, and accumulated contamination that primitive cleaning methods couldn't adequately address. Iron cookware required constant attention to prevent rust that could contaminate food and make cooking vessels unusable. The seasoning and care of cast iron equipment was a specialized skill that took years to master and could be ruined by a single mistake in cleaning or storage. Fire management tools were crude and dangerous implements that required constant attention and careful handling to prevent accidents that could destroy kitchens and kill workers. Bellows for managing fire intensity were operated by hand, requiring someone to maintain constant attention to airflow, while other workers tried to coordinate cooking tasks around fluctuating temperatures. Pokers, tongs, and other fire tools became dangerously hot during use and had to be handled with extreme caution to prevent severe burns. The storage of cooking equipment presented challenges that modern kitchens never face. Wooden handles on metal tools could rot, crack, or become infested with insects, creating safety hazards and reducing the effectiveness of essential equipment. Metal tools stored in damp conditions developed rust and corrosion that made them dangerous to use and difficult to clean properly. Improvised equipment was common in medieval kitchens where specialized tools were expensive and often unavailable. Kitchen workers had to create their own solutions using whatever materials they could find, often resulting in makeshift implements that were less effective and more dangerous than proper equipment. The creativity required to adapt and modify available tools added another layer of complexity to already overwhelming job requirements. The replacement of broken or worn-out equipment was a significant expense that many households couldn't afford, forcing kitchen workers to continue using damaged tools that increased their risk of injury and reduced their efficiency. A cracked pot that leaked, a knife with a loose handle, or a ladle with a hole in the bowl might continue to be used for months or years because alternatives weren't available. Training new workers to use primitive equipment safely and effectively was a time-consuming process that took experienced staff away from their other duties. The learning curve for medieval kitchen equipment was steep, and mistakes during the training process could result in injuries, wasted ingredients, or damaged tools that the kitchen couldn't afford to replace. The physical space constraints in medieval kitchens created additional equipment challenges as multiple workers tried to share limited tools and workspace. Arguments over access to essential equipment were common, and the lack of adequate storage meant that tools were often left in inappropriate locations where they could be damaged or create safety hazards for other workers. The seasonal maintenance of kitchen equipment required specialized knowledge and skills that not all kitchen workers possessed. Preparing tools for storage during periods of reduced cooking activity, protecting metal implements from moisture damage, and ensuring that equipment would be ready for use when needed again were all complex tasks that added to the already overwhelming workload of kitchen staff. The improvised repair of broken equipment was a necessary skill that medieval kitchen workers had to develop through trial and error. Without access to professional repair services or replacement parts, they had to find ways to extend the useful life of damaged tools using whatever materials and techniques were available to them. The documentation and inventory of kitchen equipment was virtually non-existent in most medieval households, making it difficult to track what tools were available, what needed repair or replacement, and what had been lost or stolen. This lack of systematic equipment management contributed to inefficiency and waste that strained already limited resources. The security of valuable kitchen equipment was a constant concern in environments where theft was common and replacement costs were prohibitive. Knives, metal pots, and other expensive tools had to be secured when not in use, but the primitive locking mechanisms available were often inadequate to prevent determined thieves from stealing essential equipment. The adaptation of equipment for multiple uses was a survival skill that medieval cooks had to master to make the most of their limited resources. A single pot might serve for boiling, frying, baking, and storage, depending on what other equipment was available and what tasks needed to be completed. This versatility was essential, but also meant that equipment wore out faster and was more likely to be damaged from inappropriate use. The cleaning and sanitization of equipment between different uses was a challenge that medieval kitchens were poorly equipped to handle. The same pot used for cooking meat might be quickly rinsed and immediately used for preparing vegetables, creating cross-contamination risks that could spread foodborne illnesses throughout the household. The specialized knowledge required to maintain different types of equipment was extensive and often passed down through informal apprenticeship systems that were inefficient and incomplete. Understanding how to properly season cast iron, maintain wooden handles, sharpen different types of blades, and repair various materials required expertise that took years to develop and could easily be lost when experienced workers died or moved to other positions. The psychological relationship between medieval cooks and their equipment was complex and often fraught with frustration. Workers who depended on primitive, unreliable tools for their survival and success developed both deep appreciation for functional equipment and intense anxiety about the constant threat of equipment failure that could end their careers. The social status implications of equipment quality created additional pressure for kitchen workers, who were judged not only on the food they produced, but also on their ability to maintain and effectively use whatever tools were provided to them. Workers with access to better equipment were often viewed as more skilled, while those struggling with inferior tools were blamed for their poor results, rather than recognised as victims of inadequate resources. The gender dynamics surrounding kitchen equipment usage reflected broader medieval social hierarchies, with male workers typically having priority access to the most important tools, while female workers were relegated to secondary equipment or forced to wait for their turn to use essential implements. This inequality created additional stress and inefficiency in kitchens that were already operating under impossible conditions. The regional variations in equipment availability and quality meant that cooks who moved between different locations had to constantly adapt to new tools and techniques. Skills developed with one set of equipment might be useless in a kitchen equipped with different implements, forcing workers to continually relearn basic tasks throughout their careers. The economic impact of equipment failures could be devastating for medieval kitchens operating on minimal budgets with no reserves for unexpected expenses. A broken pot or damaged knife could disrupt meal preparation for days or weeks while repairs were attempted or replacements were sought, creating cascading problems that affected every aspect of kitchen operations. The primitive nature of medieval kitchen equipment serves as a stark reminder of how much modern food service workers take for granted in terms of reliable, safe, and efficient tools. The medieval cook's daily battle with inadequate equipment, combined with all their other challenges, created working conditions that would be considered inhumane by any modern standard, yet were simply accepted as normal parts of kitchen life. The ingenuity and adaptability that medieval kitchen workers displayed in making the most of their primitive equipment speaks to remarkable human resilience and creativity, even as it highlights the brutal realities of their working environment. Their ability to produce meals under such challenging conditions deserves recognition as a testament to the importance of feeding others, regardless of the personal cost involved in that essential work. The evolution from medieval kitchen equipment to modern culinary tools represents centuries of incremental improvements that have transformed cooking from a dangerous survival skill into a safer, more efficient profession. Understanding the struggles of medieval cooks with their primitive equipment helps us appreciate the technological advances that have made modern food service possible, while honouring the memory of those who suffered and persevered under much more difficult circumstances. The legacy of medieval kitchen workers lives on, not in monuments or written histories, but in the simple fact that they maintained the foundations of culinary tradition despite working with tools and in conditions that would defeat most modern workers within hours. Their struggles with inadequate equipment were just one part of a larger story of human endurance and dedication that deserves to be remembered and respected. The training and knowledge transfer systems in medieval kitchens were as primitive and unreliable as the equipment they used, creating additional challenges for workers who needed to master complex skills without adequate instruction or support. Unlike modern culinary schools with their structured curricula and experienced instructors, medieval kitchen education was an informal, inconsistent process that depended entirely on the willingness and ability of experienced workers to share their knowledge with newcomers. Apprenticeship systems were supposed to provide systematic training for young people entering kitchen work, but the reality was often quite different from the ideal. Master cooks were typically too busy with their own overwhelming responsibilities to provide adequate instruction to apprentices, leaving young workers to learn through observation, trial and error, and occasional harsh corrections when their mistakes became too costly to ignore. The knowledge that experienced cooks possessed was often incomplete, contradictory, or based on superstition rather than scientific understanding. Techniques that worked in one kitchen might fail completely in another due to different ingredients, equipment, or environmental conditions, but medieval cooks had no way to understand why their methods sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed catastrophically. Oral tradition was the primary method for preserving and transmitting culinary knowledge, but this system was inherently unreliable and subject to gradual degradation over time. Important techniques could be lost permanently when their practitioners died unexpectedly or moved to different regions, leaving gaps in knowledge that might not be discovered until critical situations arose. The secretive nature of medieval guild systems meant that valuable techniques were often deliberately withheld from competitors, creating artificial scarcity of knowledge that prevented the systematic improvement of cooking methods and working conditions. Master cooks might take their most valuable secrets to their graves rather than share them with apprentices who might eventually become rivals for limited employment opportunities. Regional variations in cooking techniques and ingredient availability meant that knowledge gained in one location might be completely irrelevant in another area, forcing cooks who moved between different regions to essentially start their education over from the beginning. This geographical isolation of knowledge prevented the development of standardized techniques that could have improved food quality and safety across broader areas. The lack of written recipes and standardized measurements made it virtually impossible to replicate successful dishes consistently or to troubleshoot problems when techniques failed to produce expected results. Cooks had to rely on vague descriptions like "cook until done" or "season to taste," leaving enormous room for interpretation and error that could result in inedible food or dangerous contamination. Language barriers and literacy limitations further complicated knowledge transfer in medieval kitchens, where workers might speak different dialects or languages, and few could read or write even in their native tongues. Technical terminology varied between regions and social classes, making it difficult for workers from different backgrounds to communicate effectively about cooking techniques and food safety procedures. The hierarchical nature of medieval society created additional obstacles to knowledge sharing, as information typically flowed downward from masters to servants rather than being freely exchanged between workers of different social levels. This top-down system prevented the development of collaborative learning environments that might have accelerated the improvement of cooking techniques and working conditions. The gender segregation common in medieval society meant that knowledge was often compartmentalized along gender lines, with certain techniques being considered appropriate only for men or women. This artificial division prevented the full utilization of available expertise and created gaps in knowledge that could have serious consequences when the usual practitioners were unavailable. The religious and cultural taboos surrounding certain ingredients and cooking methods created additional barriers to knowledge sharing, as techniques associate religious or ethnically rejected groups might with different regardless. This cultural insult of their effectiveness arity prevented the cross-pollination of ideas that could have led to improvements in food safety and cooking efficiency. The economic pressures facing medieval kitchens meant that time for formal training was always in short supply, with new workers expected to become productive immediately rather than receiving adequate preparation for their responsibilities. This pressure to produce immediate results often led to incomplete training that left workers vulnerable to making dangerous mistakes when faced with unfamiliar situations. The physical demands of medieval kitchen work meant that older, more experienced workers were often too exhausted or physically impaired to provide effective training to newcomers. The chronic health problems that plagued kitchen workers reduced their ability to demonstrate techniques or supervise apprentices, creating a cycle where knowledge was lost as experienced workers became unable to pass on their expertise. The high turnover rate in medieval kitchens meant that institutional knowledge was constantly being lost as experienced workers died, quit, or were dismissed before they could adequately train their replacements. This constant churn of personnel prevented the accumulation of collective wisdom that could have improved working conditions and food quality over time. The competitive nature of kitchen work meant that workers often viewed their colleagues as rivals rather than collaborators, creating environments where knowledge hoarding was common and mutual support was rare. This competition for limited opportunities prevented the development of supportive learning communities that could have benefited all workers. The isolation of kitchen work meant that workers had limited exposure to new ideas and techniques that might have improved their skills and working conditions. Unlike other crafts where practitioners might interact with colleagues from different regions or backgrounds, kitchen workers were largely confined to their immediate working environments, with little opportunity for professional development. The lack of systematic feedback mechanisms meant that medieval cooks had no reliable way to evaluate the effectiveness of their techniques or identify areas for improvement. Without scientific understanding of food safety, nutrition, or cooking chemistry, they relied on trial and error methods that were inefficient and potentially dangerous. The absence of professional organisations or trade associations meant that kitchen workers had no collective voice for improving their working conditions or advocating for better training and support systems. They were isolated individuals competing for survival in a system that provided no institutional support for their professional development or welfare. The seasonal nature of medieval employment meant that training relationships were often interrupted by periods of unemployment or relocation, preventing the development of long-term mentoring relationships that could have provided more comprehensive education for new workers. This discontinuity in training created gaps in knowledge that could have serious consequences when workers faced challenging situations. The limited career advancement opportunities in medieval kitchens meant that experienced workers had little incentive to invest time and energy in training newcomers who might eventually compete for their positions. This lack of advancement potential created environments where knowledge sharing was discouraged rather than rewarded. The primitive communication methods available in medieval times meant that important information about food safety, cooking techniques, or ingredient handling could not be rapidly disseminated when new discoveries were made or dangerous conditions were identified. This slow communication prevented the timely sharing of critical knowledge that could have saved lives and prevented food-related disasters. The superstitious beliefs prevalent in medieval society often interfered with the development and transmission of practical knowledge about cooking and food safety. Techniques might be rejected or modified based on religious or cultural beliefs rather than their effectiveness, preventing the adoption of methods that could have improved working conditions and food quality. The lack of standardized terminology meant that the same technique might be described differently by different practitioners, creating confusion and inconsistency in knowledge transmission. This communication problem was compounded by regional dialects and language variations that made it difficult for workers from different areas to share information effectively. The economic instability of medieval life meant that training investments were often lost when political upheavals, natural disasters, or economic disruptions forced workers to abandon their positions before completing their education. This instability prevented the development of robust training systems that could survive temporary setbacks. The physical environment of medieval kitchens was often too noisy, smoky, and chaotic for effective verbal instruction, making it difficult for experienced workers to communicate complex techniques to newcomers. The poor lighting and dangerous working conditions further complicated training efforts by making it unsafe to demonstrate certain procedures. The medieval approach to knowledge preservation and transfer was fundamentally different from modern educational systems, relying on personal relationships and informal networks rather than institutional structures designed to systematically develop and maintain professional expertise. This informal approach was inherently fragile and subject to disruption by factors beyond the control of individual workers. The class-based nature of medieval society meant that knowledge was often stratified according to social hierarchies, with certain techniques and information being considered appropriate only for workers of specific social levels. This artificial segregation of knowledge prevented the full utilization of available expertise and created unnecessary barriers to learning and improvement. The limited understanding of learning theory and educational psychology in medieval times meant that training methods were often inefficient and ineffective, relying on repetition and punishment rather than systematic approaches designed to facilitate skill development and knowledge retention. This primitive approach to education created additional stress for both instructors and students in already challenging environments. The medieval kitchen's approach to knowledge management and worker training reflects the broader limitations of medieval society, while also highlighting the remarkable dedication of individuals who managed to preserve and transmit essential skills despite overwhelming obstacles. Their struggles with inadequate training systems were just one more challenge in lives already filled with hardship and uncertainty. The legacy of medieval kitchen training systems serves as a reminder of how far we have come in terms of professional education and knowledge management, while also honouring the memory of those who worked to preserve culinary traditions under much more difficult circumstances. Their efforts laid the foundation for the sophisticated training systems that modern culinary professionals take for granted today. Understanding the training challenges faced by medieval kitchen workers helps us appreciate both the complexity of their work and the resilience they displayed in mastering essential skills without adequate support or instruction. Their ability to maintain food traditions and develop new techniques despite primitive training systems speaks to remarkable human adaptability and determination. The social isolation that characterized medieval kitchen work extended far beyond the physical separation from the main household activities. Kitchen workers existed in a strange liminal space within medieval society, essential to the functioning of their employers' lives, yet largely invisible and undervalued by the very people who depended on their skills for survival and social status. This isolation was both physical and psychological, creating unique stresses that modern food service workers rarely experience to the same degree. Medieval kitchens were typically located in separate buildings or distant wings of larger structures, isolating kitchen staff from the social interactions and community connections that might have provided emotional support and relief from their demanding work environment. The isolation wasn't just a matter of physical distance, it was a deliberate social structure designed to keep kitchen workers separate from the people they served, reinforcing class boundaries while ensuring that the messy, dangerous, and unglamorous reality of food preparation remained hidden from those who enjoyed its results. This separation created a psychological burden that added to the already overwhelming challenges of medieval kitchen work. Medieval kitchen workers developed their own subculture within the larger household structure, forming tight bonds born of shared hardship and mutual dependence. These relationships were often the only source of emotional support available to people whose lives were consumed by relentless physical labour and constant stress. Yet even these friendships were complicated by the competitive nature of kitchen hierarchies and the ever-present threat that economic pressures might force individuals to betray colleagues in order to preserve their own positions. The language used to describe kitchen workers reflected their low social status and the contempt with which they were often regarded by their social superiors. They were referred to using terms that emphasized their function rather than their humanity, reducing complex individuals with their own hopes, fears, and dreams to mere extensions of the cooking equipment they operated. This dehumanizing language both reflected and reinforced the social barriers that kept kitchen workers isolated from broader community life. Marriage and family relationships were particularly challenging for medieval kitchen workers, whose demanding schedules and low social status made them less desirable as partners. The physical toll of kitchen work aged workers prematurely, while the constant exposure to smoke, heat, and dangerous working conditions left many with chronic health problems that further reduced their attractiveness to potential spouses. Even when kitchen workers did manage to form romantic relationships, the demands of their jobs often prevented them from maintaining the emotional intimacy and time investment that successful marriages required. Children of kitchen workers face their own unique challenges growing up in environments where their parents were constantly absent, exhausted, or preoccupied with work-related stress. These children often received minimal education and were frequently pressed into kitchen service at young ages, perpetuating cycles of poverty and limited opportunity that trapped entire families in the lowest levels of medieval social hierarchy. The religious life of medieval kitchen workers was complicated by their irregular schedules and the physical demands of their work. While the broader medieval society organised its daily rhythm around religious observances and seasonal celebrations, kitchen workers often found themselves unable to participate fully in these community rituals due to the necessity of preparing meals for others who were free to observe religious requirements. Sunday services and religious holidays presented particular challenges for kitchen staff who were expected to prepare elaborate meals for households celebrating these occasions while being denied the opportunity to participate meaningfully in the religious observances themselves. This exclusion from community religious life added to their social isolation and may have contributed to feelings of spiritual alienation that compounded their other hardships. The legal status of medieval kitchen workers was precarious and offered them little protection against exploitation or abuse. Unlike members of craft guilds who enjoyed certain legal protections and collective bargaining rights, kitchen workers were typically considered domestic servants with minimal legal standing and few avenues for seeking redress when they were mistreated by their employers. Violence against kitchen workers was common and rarely punished, as their low social status made their testimony virtually worthless in legal proceedings dominated by their social superiors. Physical abuse, sexual assault, and other forms of mistreatment were often ignored by authorities who viewed kitchen workers as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving of protection and respect. The economic vulnerability of kitchen workers made them particularly susceptible to various forms of exploitation beyond simple wage theft or harsh working conditions. They might be forced to purchase their own tools and uniforms from their employers at inflated prices, creating debt relationships that further reduced their already minimal income. Some employers required kitchen workers to pay for their own food and lodging, effectively reducing their wages to below subsistence levels. The lack of job security meant that kitchen workers could be dismissed without notice or cause, leaving them with no income and often no shelter. The specialised nature of their skills meant that finding alternative employment was difficult, particularly during economic downturns when households reduced their staff or eliminated positions entirely. This vulnerability created a climate of fear that prevented workers from complaining about dangerous conditions or seeking better treatment. Seasonal employment patterns created additional economic hardship for kitchen workers who might be employed during busy periods but dismissed during slower times of the year. These periods of unemployment provided no income while still requiring workers to maintain themselves and their families, often forcing them to exhaust any savings they might have accumulated during periods of employment. The geographic isolation of many medieval households meant that kitchen workers had limited access to alternative employment opportunities within reasonable travelling distance. This isolation trapped workers in exploitative situations where they might endure abuse rather than risk unemployment in areas where other opportunities simply didn't exist. The social stigma associated with kitchen work created barriers to advancement that went beyond simple lack of education or training. Even kitchen workers, who managed to acquire additional skills or knowledge, often found themselves unable to transition to higher status occupations because their association with kitchen work marked them as belonging to the lowest social classes. The health consequences of medieval kitchen work extended far beyond the immediate dangers of burns, cuts, and smoke inhalation. The chronic stress of working in dangerous conditions with inadequate resources created long-term health problems that modern medical science recognizes as preventable occupational diseases. The constant anxiety about food safety, fire hazards, and employer satisfaction created psychological conditions that would be diagnosed today as chronic stress disorders. Nutritional deficiencies were common among kitchen workers, who were often fed the lowest quality food available in the household. Despite being surrounded by food preparation, they typically received inadequate nutrition that contributed to various health problems including scurvy, rickets, and other diseases caused by dietary deficiencies. The irony of malnutrition among people whose job was to prepare food for others highlights the extreme inequality that characterized medieval society. Sleep deprivation was a chronic problem for kitchen workers, whose duties often began before dawn and continued well into the evening. The poor quality sleep available in crowded, uncomfortable quarters shared with other workers contributed to physical exhaustion and mental health problems that made their already dangerous work even more hazardous. The reproductive health of female kitchen workers was particularly affected by their working conditions. The physical demands of kitchen work, combined with poor nutrition and exposure to various toxins, contributed to higher rates of miscarriage, stillbirth, and maternal mortality. Many women working in kitchens experienced irregular menstrual cycles and fertility problems that may have been related to their harsh working conditions. Male kitchen workers also faced reproductive health challenges, including reduced fertility that may have been caused by exposure to extreme heat, toxic smoke, and the chronic stress that characterized their working environment. The physical demands of kitchen work often led to injuries that could affect sexual function and reproductive capacity. The life expectancy of medieval kitchen workers was significantly lower than that of people in higher social classes, reflecting both the dangerous nature of their work and the cumulative health effects of poverty, poor nutrition, and chronic stress. Many kitchen workers died in their 30s or 40s from conditions that would be preventable or treatable today. The mental health challenges facing medieval kitchen workers were compounded by the complete lack of understanding or support systems for psychological distress. Depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions were often attributed to moral failings or supernatural influences rather than being recognized as natural responses to extremely stressful living conditions. The social isolation of kitchen work prevented workers from developing the support networks that might have helped them cope with the psychological challenges of their occupation. Unlike other medieval workers who might belong to guilds, religious organizations, or community groups that provided mutual support, kitchen workers were largely on their own when facing personal crises or mental health challenges. The constant exposure to death and suffering in medieval kitchens, from slaughtering animals to witnessing the effects of food poisoning, created psychological trauma that had no recognized treatment or support systems. Kitchen workers had to develop their own coping mechanisms for dealing with these experiences, often leading to emotional numbing or other psychological adaptations that may have affected their ability to form healthy relationships. The medieval understanding of mental health was so primitive that kitchen workers experiencing psychological distress might be accused of being possessed by demons or cursed by supernatural forces. These accusations could lead to additional persecution and isolation, making their mental health problems even worse while providing no actual treatment or support. The cultural attitudes toward kitchen work reflected broader medieval beliefs about social hierarchy and divine order that justified the exploitation of workers by portraying their suffering as natural and inevitable. Religious teachings often emphasized acceptance of one's social position as part of God's plan, discouraging kitchen workers from seeking to improve their conditions or challenge the systems that oppress them. The artistic and literary representations of medieval life rarely included realistic portrayals of kitchen work, instead focusing on idealized images of abundance and celebration that ignored the human cost of producing elaborate feasts. This cultural invisibility of kitchen workers' experiences prevented broader society from understanding or addressing the problems they faced. The oral traditions and folk songs of medieval kitchen workers provided some outlet for expressing their frustrations and preserving their experiences, but these cultural expressions were rarely recorded or preserved by the literate classes who controlled historical documentation. Most of what we know about medieval kitchen work comes from administrative records and legal documents that focus on practical concerns rather than human experiences. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created predictable cycles of stress and hardship for kitchen workers that modern employees rarely experience. The approach of winter brought anxiety about food stores and fuel supplies, while spring cleaning and summer preservation work created periods of intense labour that pushed workers to their physical and mental limits. The unpredictability of medieval life meant that kitchen workers lived in constant uncertainty about their future security and well-being. Political upheavals, natural disasters, economic disruptions, and changes in their employers' circumstances could destroy their livelihoods without warning, creating chronic anxiety that affected every aspect of their daily lives. So the next time you're having a rough day in a modern kitchen, when the orders are backing up and the heat is getting to you, take a moment to remember these forgotten souls who kept medieval society fed. They worked without safety nets, without workers' rights, without even the basic dignity that modern labour laws guarantee. Their lives were consumed by an endless cycle of danger, exhaustion, and thankless service to people who barely acknowledged their humanity. Yet somehow, through sheer stubborn determination and an unbreakable human spirit, they endured. They created the foundations of culinary tradition that we still build upon today, one smoky, dangerous, back-breaking meal at a time.